Welcome to the Optimistic Views podcast, and I am your host, Lawrence Amsterdam.
I followed the whole vibe, the whole story, and it's kind of real because a lot of the stuff that you mentioned I can resonate with, you know what I mean?
Right. All right. Welcome to episode 5 of the Optimistic Views podcast. Today I have a really special guest with me. She is somebody that I met in a class of mine that I'm taking, an African American literature class, and I just started asking some good questions. And from that, we had a little bit of a dialogue. I introduced myself, told her about the podcast, what it's about, and she said, hey, I would love to do it. I would love to come on there and talk about what I do. So thank you for being on this episode with me, and welcome, Miss JoyEllen Freeman.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to do this.
Nice. So what I usually like to do when I start the podcast, I prefer to have the guests more so introduce themselves because they can tell more about themselves than I can. So go ahead and just give like a brief description of who you are and what is it that you do.
Okay. My name is JoyEllen Freeman, and I am the Outreach and Special Collections Archivist at Kennesaw State University, specifically in the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books. So I work with historical documents and rare books all day. I generally do a lot of class sessions. I work with researchers. I do community outreach, public programs, and exhibits. So multifaceted job.
Very detailed list there as well. So for those who might not know, and as a refresher for me, even though I know a little bit of it, what is an archivist?
Okay, great question. So an archivist is a person who basically is in charge of the identification, the preservation, and the management of documents and records of value. So archivists are people that do a lot of work to make sure that we can experience history for many years and into the future. We work with both paper records, photographs, audiovisual material, digital records, and rare books. So that's kind of what we do. We want to preserve them, but we also want to make them accessible to the public.
That's pretty good. When you were giving the presentation in my class, it just struck me. It really struck me like, whoa, I've never heard of the word before. Mm-hmm. I've heard of archive before, yep. Obviously from folders, maybe on your phone or your computer, but I've never heard of an archivist. And to listen to, what you do as a profession was really important. So for the perspective of a young person who might not have an idea of, what they want to do, what they want to major in, talk about your journey to becoming an archivist.
Sure. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because a lot of times when I go in the community and people, they've been emailing me or calling me, and I get there, they're like, you seem really young to be doing this job. Yeah. And they don't expect someone who's younger to be interested in anything, right. History related, I guess. And so, and I said, well, I think that, it's an incredible job for someone my age or of any age. And I can explain kind of how I got there. I didn't know about being an archivist at all. When I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Georgia. For my undergraduate, I majored in English. And I started to do a lot of work with an English professor who was working with the Digital Library of Georgia and different initiatives that it kind of was a lot of historical writing, I guess you would say, a lot of historical writing. But in order to do that, I had to work with archives. And I didn't know really what archives were. And so I just thought that these historical documents were so cool. Right. And the professor, I asked her, I'm like, that's really cool that I have access to all this stuff. And she said, oh, an archivist does that. And I was just like, so what's that? And through her mentorship and just talking to other librarians and archivists, I started to understand the field. And then I went ahead and graduated, got my master's degree in archival studies, but I first did quite a few internships to make sure I knew that's what I wanted to do. And
wow.
Yeah.
So you graduated with a master's. What was the most difficult thing in that time frame?
Yeah.
Because a master's in, what is it you majored in?
Archival studies.
Archival studies. So basically a lot of people don't know that. So, like, you know, before we go into something, most times as humans we want to know what's the most difficult thing because we want to be prepared to when we encounter it. So what has been the most difficult stint for you in that?
Yeah, so for graduate school, I think for me it was really hard to decide because, you know, some archivists get their master's degree in library science and then they specialize in archives. But I was kind of, I guess you could say, taking a little bit of a risk by doing archival studies because that degree, I would not really have the certification to be a librarian. I would only be an archivist. And I think some people like to keep, in case they can't get an archivist job, at least they have their library, a plan B.
Right.
I did not have a plan B with my master's degree. I was going to be an archivist, but that was something that I felt comfortable doing.
Right.
I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I had done, you know, quite a few internships, so knew quite a few people in the field, so I felt like, you know, this is what I really want. I don't really want to be just a librarian. I prefer to do archives. So that was a bit of a risk. Also, I worked full-time and did school at night, and so I was just kind of tired for those 3 years. But
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
I can only imagine. To you, what is the importance of archiving for somebody who doesn't know, or and also for people who know about archiving, what is the significance of it?
I always love that question because I think I answer it in such a simple way and people are always like, what? I say that archives matter because humans matter, because you matter, because I matter.
Right.
And I think sometimes people don't realize that archives are records of human experiences.
Wow.
And they're evidence of what happened, the good, the bad, the ugly, the victorious, the challenges. And so I think that when we're able to kind of see history in the raw, history that's uninterpreted, history that challenges, history that sometimes it's conflicting. Sometimes you'll see one record and another one, and they say opposite things, but they're both claiming to tell the truth. All of that together is what creates our story as humans. And I think this collective story of human life is just so invaluable and rich. And I think that when we're able to connect with that, sometimes we don't always realize the importance of it, but when we're able to connect with that, it can really change our lives. So I try to give people life-changing moments.
Right.
Even if they resist it at first, I try to give them life-changing moments every day.
Gotcha. That is a very, as you said, it's a very simple answer, but it's the honest truth. And from the lecture that you gave, what I got from it is the importance of also giving people of color credit for the things they have done in history, because a lot of times what happens is that African Americans in U.S. history, not only U.S. history, but world history, Africans have always been discredited. They might have an innovation, but because at that time you probably belong to somebody else, or you're the property of somebody else, or even in a condition when you are considered free, people still take your work and they get credit for it. And then today, in 2017, 2018, 2019, we only look back at certain things and we look at, well, this is what school taught us who invented it.
Right.
We don't really do the investigation to see that, you know, a lot of the everyday things that we use were actually created by African Americans and by people of African descent. So I think that is a very, very important fact about archiving. That's what I got from that class.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you got that, because some people, I think, you know, if you take a very surface level look at it, you would think, oh, okay, well, primary sources are better than secondary sources. So I'll just, when I go to the archives, I'll believe everything that I look at. And I say, no. I'm going to give you these primary sources, but the goal is to challenge them. Because sometimes we'll see records and we're like, you know, you'll see things, and like you said, sometimes you're like, well, wait a minute. Let's take a look at who's being excluded from these records.
Right.
What are we not talking about? Who are the people that are not represented? For many archival institutions years ago, back, you know, earlier in the 20th century, there weren't even like words, like you wouldn't find words about African American women or African Americans at all, even in some databases or finding aids, because no one found that history important enough to talk about, or it didn't exist, quote unquote.
That's the one that always gets me.
There's a word that an archival scholar from UCLA uses. Her name is Michelle Caswell. She's brilliant. But in one of her articles, she talked about something called symbolic annihilation, and it's how marginalized groups feel a way to describe how marginalized groups feel when they are left out of the historical record or misrepresented within the historical record.
Wow.
And I think that's a big thing we have to remember, because sometimes, in an archival collection, you will have records about a group of people, but what about records by the group of people? What about those people speaking in their own words? So there's so many different facets to representing an inclusive history that archivists are still trying to figure out today.
That's pretty impressive. It's funny that you mentioned people sharing their own stories rather than other people writing it for them, because yesterday in that same class, we had to do 2 readings, and the readings were basically hitting the point of let us tell our stories, because African American literature wasn't a thing. It recently became popularized into popular culture, and before then, the only time you would hear about an African American is slavery and Jim Crow. But you're not letting us tell our stories. So I think the article that we read, the basis, not the basis, but the main ingredient was let us tell our own story, because we see ourselves one way. You have a different perspective of us. You see us as slaves. We see ourselves as kings and queens, because that's what our recollection is. And today, our recollection of Black people or people of African descent is slaves. Back then, their recollection is, I was a king in Uganda.
Right.
I was a king in Nigeria, or a prince, or of this tribe, or whatever the case is. So I think it's very important to allow people to tell their stories. And that's why I think archiving is so impressive, because you get to actually tap into a certain amount of resources that can back up your opinions that you have on things, or you can actually have an opinion and then you go look and find research that actually helps you to formulate a more educated opinion on that thought. So I think that is very, very important.
I think that's a great point. And one thing I would love to let everyone know too is that you can, you don't have to be an archivist to do this kind of, sometimes this kind of work. So getting people's stories, that's one of the things we like to do through our oral histories, because sometimes we can't get all the records that we want from a certain family or from a certain group of people, but we can ask them questions while they're still here. So if you have a grandparent, an aunt, or even just your parents, just getting their story sometimes is just so important to asking them what they remember, how they remember certain things or certain events that took place, or how they view themselves, or how that has evolved over time. And then, saving that is something that you can, we call that, personal archiving. That's something everyone can do. Yeah. And it's extremely important, like you said. So I'm glad you brought that up.
No, absolutely. Also, one of the things that, as I said, since I've been exposed to this field, is what you just mentioned, being able to talk to the elderlies in your family and stuff like that. And somebody near and dear to me, she always used to share stories, my grandmother. And, I'd be like, I've heard this story 100 times, but she shares it all the time. Yeah. And I went back to New York a couple of weeks ago, about 2 months ago, for her 95th birthday. And, with age comes a little bit of memory loss and stuff like that. And it sucks now, because some of those stories she was telling me, I can't remember them.
Of course.
And I can't go back and, try to ask her to say, Granny, can you tell me this story? Or can you, because she can't really remember those things. So I kind of regret, but some of them were very vivid to me. I remember her telling me she had to walk like 10 miles with a basket on her head and all these different things. And it's like so many things that you could learn from just listening to elderly people. And even on episode 2 of the podcast, Mr. Barton that I had on the podcast, he talked about like